The whole brain, from my perspective, is emotional. And I'll explain what that means in one second. But I just want to start by saying that for many, many years, people went looking for the seat of particular emotions in particular regions. And this was really consistent with how people were kind of theorizing about emotions, that emotions are these modules, right? That a particular type of event or class of event triggers a particular emotion, right? And so there's a circuit in the brain for anger or sadness or fear, or there's a location in the brain for anger, sadness, fear. We don't see a lot of evidence for that.
Our emotional state at any given moment is how we assess the quality of our lives. Whether we're happy, sad, angry, depressed, that's who we are. But where do emotions come from? Do we own them or do they own us? Today's guest is Eliza Bliss-Moreau, one of the country's leading experts on the biological underpinnings of the human experience. She's here to help us understand some of the complexities of human emotion. Stay tuned. We are going to talk today about emotions.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think would probably escape most people is that they have physiological origin, yeah?
Yeah, of course. All human experience, animal experience starts in the body and the brain. So yeah, certainly. They're based in physiology and our neural activity.
Because I know the way I've heard emotions characterized is they come from without. They're based on your history, like your personal history, your environment, things like that. Is any of that true? Did any of those things contribute to emotions, or is it pure chemistry?
That's a really good question. Yeah, all of those things contribute to emotions. So I think people walk around experiencing emotions in a variety of different ways, but often they experience them as an event happens, and then the emotion happens, and then something happens in physiology or behavior. And the sort of current, most contemporary thinking about emotion is that emotions come to be based on all of those processes you just talked about. So there is a physiological origin, there's a neural instantiation in the brain, but we learn categories and concepts based on the social environments in which we grow up, the cultures, the languages that are present in those cultures. And so it is an interplay between a sort of the external world and the internal world, which shapes our experience, our development, and how we use and or deploy emotion terms in different situations. So you and I could walk into the same situation and have completely different emotional experiences because of our personal histories and the concepts we have and how we understand those concepts and we use them in our daily life.
Yeah, that's kind of weird, because I think a lot of times we maybe I don't know what your thought about this is. We put too much on people for owning their emotions. Like to say, your emotional control. You lack emotional control or things. How does that register with what you see from the physiological? Is it? I'm thinking that if your body chemistry is saying respond a certain way, it's a lot harder for you to control your emotions. Is it insurmountable?
So I think it's maybe not even the right question to ask, right? So the idea of controllability suggests that something happens and you have an emotion and then you regulate it after the fact, or maybe you control just the output. Maybe you have it internally and you control how it's expressed externally. And there's a whole other way of looking at this situation in terms of how emotions come to be, which is that they're actively built. And so sure, they may begin in a physiological state, but that physiological state isn't directed necessarily in one direction to become one specific emotion. We talk about the physiology of affect, and that's what my group works on. And in psychological terms, affect is a state that varies in valence or hedonics, from very unpleasant to very pleasant, and then some arousal or physiological activation. And we think about affect in psychological terms and also in biological terms, but you can have a very similar affective state. Let's take, for example, a negative, very high arousal affective state. And depending on the context, the experience you had prior, whether you're hungry or not in a moment, that could become anger or disgust or fear, which are all really different experiences. We tend to think of people move throughout the world as if that just happens, right? That, okay, things are bad and it's anger, or things are bad and it's fear. The situation warrants fear. In actuality, we're thinking increasingly that we have some control, to use the term you just used, but we are engaged in an active process of building that state as anger or fear or disgust from more foundational or fundamental building blocks. So in that sense, it's less about control and more about how we are actively creating our experiences. It's just sometimes we don't have a sense that we've actively participated in their creation. It feels like we're kind of controlling them after the fact. But that changes the script a little bit, because it means that people do have a significant level of sort of personal responsibility to think about, to how they deploy emotion concepts, to learn new emotion concepts. There are one of the most effective tools for changing your mental life is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is at its core about learning how to navigate the world in terms of new concepts and understanding of those concepts. And so it's less about being in control of the situation. So much of this is recognizing you have personal responsibility and you have the power, I think from a kind of more positive spin, you have a lot of personal power to shape in an active way what your emotional life looks like, and to make it better if it's not good, or to shift it in a particular direction to better match the culture that you're living in, and so on.
Okay. That I feel forgivable.
Yeah, forgivable, empowered. I think also, the concepts for emotions, they come online in a cultural context and based on the language that you speak. And some of that feels a little bit inevitable based on where you grow up and the language that you speak at home, the language that you speak at school, or you're trained at in school. But there's a lot of variation across family units and how emotions are made or not made. I come from a WASP family, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and we don't do pride culturally. And I have a very good friend whose expertise is pride, and she's always just flabbergasted that I just never experienced pride because it's not an emotion that we talked about very much growing up. I know what it means. I know how to deploy the term when I'm asked. I know the appropriate context for it, but I just don't experience it very much. And so you can have these matches or mismatches between a person's experience and the dominant culture that they're living in and language. But that also creates opportunities for growth and changing your experience in some active ways. And I've tried to change my pride experience, and I just think maybe not.
Well, of all the things you probably want to be on the lower side of, pride always seems to be like one of those. That's a hair, it's like that's a trigger thing. So.
Yeah, there are a lot of people whose expertise are emotions will often say, "Oh, it's not a monolith, right?" And pride's a really good example. There are kind of different flavors of pride that are deployed in different contexts. It may be appropriate in some contexts and not in others, and some carry positive meaning and some carry negative meaning. And folks who are really concentrated on understanding emotions per se get deep in the weeds about how people use these concepts and these terms in different contexts, and how they learn about that, how they actively use that, how they might try to regulate that as well. So yeah, there's varieties of pride, certainly.
Well, as speaking of someone from Northern European descent, who we are known to be combative, so never met a fight we couldn't. We couldn't dream we could win anyway. So, but that begs a question about: are there parts of the brain that responds to certain stimuli that would generate, like emotions? Are they hidden in different parts of the brain? Are they one central location? How is that triggered?
It's a good question. So the whole brain, from my perspective, is emotional. And I'll explain what that means in 1 second. But I just want to start by saying that for many, many years, people went looking for the seat of particular emotions in particular regions. And this was really consistent with how people were kind of theorizing about emotions, that emotions are these modules, right? That a particular type of event or class of event triggers a particular emotion, right? And so there's a circuit in the brain for anger, or sadness, or fear, or there's a location in the brain for anger, sadness, fear. And we don't see a lot of evidence for that. Although if you go digging in the scientific literature, you will find papers here or there that seem to kind of consistently point to one area being associated with a particular emotion. A number of years ago now, more than a decade ago, we did a meta-analysis. It was led by a colleague in graduate school, Kristen Lindquist, on neuroimaging studies of emotion. So somewhat dated, but at the time it was as most comprehensive as we could get. So it was from the very beginning of imaging through 2000, the end of the 2010, 11 or so. It was published in 2012. And we asked the question, like, are we seeing particular regions of the brain consistently active during particular emotions? And the answer is no. And so that, moving from that sort of perspective to, okay, well, what is the brain actually doing to build emotions? There are different sort of paths that different types of scientists take to answer that question. And so I would say for people working with people, by and large, the understanding is that brains accomplish things via networks. So there are some regions that seem to do a particular thing, but by and large, even those regions are participating with other regions to generate emotion, but also memory, thought, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would say there's sort of global processes in the brain that come together to help you build an emotion. So you need to have, for example, if you are looking at a face and you label it with a word, you'll see activity in regions that are responsible for language and concepts, as well as regions that are responsible for perceiving faces. And those regions play those roles, language and concepts and perceiving faces, even when it's not about emotion. So it's essentially, we would call it like an ensemble, a bunch of different regions coming together to ultimately build an emotion state. There are other people who are pursuing these questions from different sort of evolutionary perspectives to start asking, okay, what do brains actually do? And can we start with sort of first principles about evolution and build from there and generate a completely different understanding about how emotions come to be in the brain? But I think at the moment, the evidence is pretty clear. There's not a particular seat of emotions in the brain generally. So it's not like this is the emotion network or this is the fear network even. But the different parts of the brain are specialized to do different sorts of things. And those things come together to allow us to have an emotion.
So because it's one of the things that I've always heard is like the amygdala, that's where fight or flight lives.
Yeah.
That's all of your aggression stems from there. And it's like, I guess, 50 million years older than the cerebrum, which is where all the logic kind of comes in. So, but what you're saying is maybe maybe not crass, but it's a generalization, and the network is where the magic happens. Yeah,
I kind of accidentally became an amygdalologist, I think is what they call it, which is when I arrived here, I inherited animals who didn't have amygdalas, and my mentor at the time had very strong hypotheses about fear. And it is the case that processing related to fear was mucked up in these animals. But this is an example of where the theory that we hold really drives what we end up seeing. So it's certainly the case that the amygdala does do fear. There's no debate. But it does so much more than fear, right? And the question is, what's the sort of unifying theme across all the things it does? What is it coding from the environment? What does it allow us to do in terms of action? And in the case of the work that I did early on in my postdoc, the group had not asked a lot of questions about the positive functions that the amygdala was involved in because they had such strong hypotheses about fear. It's sort of like the streetlight parable where there's a person looking for keys under a streetlight and somebody stops and asks them, what are you looking for? Keys. They search together, they don't find them, and the helper says, where did you lose them? And he says, way back there. And the guy says, well, why are you looking here? It's like, because there's a street, the light is here, I can see here. In this case, there's a there, so we find the keys, but we find only one key, and there are lots of other keys hidden around in the darkness that we don't find because we're not looking for them. And so we demonstrated early on that these animals who didn't have a functioning amygdalas, sure, they were not reactive to things related to fear, but they also weren't reactive to positive things. And so that work, in the concert of lots of other work that people are doing on the amygdala, set the stage, at least for me, to think about the amygdala as being involved in valence more generally, and coding what sort of things are important to an individual at a given time and place. And so if you go looking for fear, you'll find it in places, but that's like not the only thing to find, basically. And the fact that it does these other things helps explain other findings in the brain. So we're trying to take a more global approach, both in terms of emotional or affective space, and then also in terms of thinking of the amygdala connected to other things. But you're absolutely correct. still in textbooks being taught on this campus today. You'll see those sorts of things. And then also students will say that their frontal cortex controls their amygdala or controls their, subcortical structures. And there's certainly connections, and some of them are inhibitory. But these parts of the brain are working together to generate states. And each plays a particular role in that, but it's not like there's the amygdala, there's fear.
Well, I've always thought of the amygdala as I've always associated with the fight or flight.
Yeah.
And in an evolutionary context, the thing that said, there's you, there's me, there's a stake between us. Amygdala says, I'm going to fight you for this stake. One of us is going to win. Whoever's the more physical you, whoever's going to have like the most aggression, coupled with the most strength is going to win. They're going to pass their genes on because they're able to fight more often. So I'm circling back to this animal that doesn't have an amygdala. I'm wondering how they got here.
Oh, how? We've removed, I didn't, but their amygdalas were removed in order to study these things. So that's one of the tools that's used in neuroscience. It's used a little, I would say, less frequently now. We use different sort of kind of more precise tools now. But one of the ways that we know things about the brain is that in animals, people have perturbed either locations like the amygdala or circuits. So when I say a circuit, I'm thinking about the connections between two regions. And so you can do a surgery and you can change the way the brain is functioning, and then you can study what happens after that for a long period of time to understand the contribution of those regions to the process. And I think one of the insights from this work, so this is kind of classic neurophysiology work, and the human sort of component is looking at how people who have strokes, or they have surgeries for epilepsy, or they have some sort of other, like a tumor removed, how changing their brains in a sort of permanent way shifts function. There's a real sort of overlap in these studies insofar as the work in animals has informed how people do surgeries in humans, so that they don't have catastrophic memory effects, for example. And so there's real synergy there. But the other kind of more modern take on this, when you perturb a brain region, the brain starts to reorganize really dramatically. And even 10, 15 years ago, I think we didn't understand how dramatically it reorganized, even though there was plenty of evidence in people that people could have a stroke, a debilitating stroke, and lose function in a hand or a foot or a limb and regain some of that function. So we knew there was some plasticity, but in these animal models where we're perturbing the brain and then studying animals over time, we're able to figure out at a cellular level what's changing and how brains are beginning to retune to their environments so that they can accomplish some of the tasks you're talking about, these survival tasks, right? Like fight or flight. But of course, the kind of more complicated the world you live in, the more complicated are the actions that you need to engage in to survive, and the brain will reorganize to accommodate those.
Right, and I'm thinking from just our common societal perspective, there are people who were just born to argue. They're born to fight. And I always trace that back to, and I'm coming at it from, this place where I'm saying amygdala is fight or flight, the cerebrum is communal living and language and interpretation, appreciation for all the things that are beautiful about life. That's where the cerebrum comes in place. So it's interesting, and I'm wondering if there are implications for humanity, when you've seen the animals who have had their amygdala removed, are they generally more passive, more docile, or are they anti-aggression?
Totally contextually dependent, which is part of the complicated story, because historically those animals have only been tested in a small number of contexts. But what we saw is they're just kind of like less socially engaged. Over time and development, they kind of normalized. So at the end, in their adulthood, their social behavior looked very much like the neurologically intact animals that we raised them with. But their affect was always kind of blunted. So the sort of observation that led me to start testing them on positive stimuli was that on Friday afternoons, we used to give them popsicles with fruit in it, Tang juice, And you would walk into the room with this bin, and most of the animals would just go wild because this is like deliciousness. And the animals who had amygdala damage would just sit. They'd take it and they'd eat it, but there was no like joie de vivre about them. And so they were processing the stimuli. They ate just fine. They drank just fine. It wasn't an issue of like a lack of ability to feed themselves. But there didn't seem to be such a positive response to this stimulus that the other animals thought was quite positive. And so, yeah, it's not that, they're dramatically different on many things, but they're just kind of blunted, and that blunting probably relates to their social behavior. So when you talk about people being like kind of born to fight or born to be social, there are some proclivities from birth and temperamental features kind of early on in life that play out across the lifespan. But there's also like a lot of change across the lifespan, and there's wonderful people here who study personality change. But there's these cycles that kind of feed into each other, right? So if you don't evaluate the world in terms of good or bad, you just kind of are there. You might not pursue social relationships that inherently make you feel good because they don't make you feel as good as they might otherwise. And so then you might have less strong social relationships, and you have this sort of cycle. And so it's not that we, over time, they can kind of like start to look normal, I think, because we put them in environments that give them a lot of feedback. And I don't know what would have happened if we had put them in other sort of environments.
Or just kept them to themselves.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something, and I apologize. You used words that I can't remember, but it was the place where epiphanies are born. There was an environmental, let's say, a dramatic environmental happening that changed the way that opened up new paths of your neural receptors or whatever.
Yeah.
And that has a pretty dramatic effect. Yeah. I mean, like, I'm speaking from people I know who have gone through something, who have considered themselves like immediately enlightened, who have kind of used that word like epiphany, and it usually comes on the heels of something really hard to go through. So do you see a lot of that in your research too? Like that impact can rewire that, and you kind of alluded to that earlier.
Yeah. So in terms of like what can help shape the brain, there are all sorts of biological things, right, that can happen. But how we interpret experience also can really dramatically change our subsequent experience. And the extent to which it's changing cells and synapses, I don't know. But it's definitely the case that if you have a life-changing event and it changes how you process information, it changes what information you seek out, you can change your life basically by self-selecting down particular paths. In the sort of idea of epiphany or like life-changing event, I don't know entirely how we would model that in animals to get to the sort of cellular level mechanisms. But certainly we can create environments that are really enriched or environments that are more deprived. I think historically in the non-human animal literature, the manipulations have been to reduce social environment, and we've kind of changed the path on that, and we increase social environment. So what happens if we put you in a more enriched social environment? Does that change your brain in strategic ways? Does it change your behavior? Does it change your perception of positive and negative things in the environment? And yeah, we can change the environment and change all of those features, and presumably that's happening in neural circuits, and we're working on trying to figure out which neural circuits are kind of most flexible and able to accommodate those changes, and also which neural circuits kind of take over if something goes awry. So that could be something during early fetal development, or which we work on fetal brain development all the way through old age, when diseases of aging like Alzheimer's. When something goes off the rails biologically, how does the brain accommodate that to try to keep things stabilized and normal?
So these things have an impact. Have you stumbled upon anything that looks like a recipe? I mean, like if you could write the future for an organism and say, if you had this experience or considered this way.
I would say that we have ideas about the ingredients for a recipe for different sorts of species. And because humans are primates, we have to be really careful about the animals that we're studying to figure out what those ingredients are, because they need to look something like us. And I don't just mean like faces. I mean, they need to share some biological features, or they need to share a behavioral, what we call niche or ecological niche, so we kind of fit into the world in a similar place. And so, people will talk about, primates and great apes, but humans and non-human great apes share a lot of biological features, but live in really different environments and have really different levels of adaptability. And so, one of the reasons that my lab works primarily with rhesus monkeys that we have on campus here is because rhesus monkeys, like humans, are weeds. So we are weed species. We can exist in any physiologically habitable climate. We don't just exist and survive in those places, we thrive in those places, and we actually end up bending those places kind of to our will. So environmental change is at our hands, but rhesus monkeys engage in environmental change too. They'll decimate forest areas, and they change human behavior. So in the places where we study the interaction between macaque monkeys and people, we see people's behavior changing a lot when they have to live with rhesus monkeys, in terms of how they take their trash out and how they walk to work and all these sort of like kind of things that seem quite simple, but they're really dramatic when you look at it at large scale. And so, when you think about rhesus and humans, the thing I think that we share with rhesus monkeys is just like high level of adaptability, a high level of sort of curiosity, and drive to fiddle with things, right? And so it's not just about trial and error to learn, but actually there seems to be what we might anthropomorphize in monkeys enjoyment, but we know in humans, like humans fiddling with things. They like to, people like to build things and take things apart and build things again and take things apart. It's a sort of like nexus of human ingenuity. And so for rhesus monkeys and for humans, I think there are some foundational building blocks. Social environment is probably number one. And having that social environment be robust, meaning you have a variety of different social partners who engage you in different sorts of ways for different reasons at different times. I think that's really important. Positive relationships are great, but having conflict and having to work out and work through conflict is also super important for health and disease. So social environment is probably number one. And then there's all these environmental factors, having clean water and like a reasonable food source. And I think as psychologists, we tend to think about those sorts of things less, but they're certainly impactful, particularly in the context of climate change and poverty. So a robust social environment, having your kind of basic physiological needs met, and some predictability in your environment. So being able to learn about the environment on one day and then take what you've learned and have that be the springboard for what you learn the next day is really important. In cases where animals and people, non-human animals and people, live in really unpredictable environments where what they learn on day one kind of doesn't predict what happens on day two. That's inherently not good for the body. It creates wear and tear on physiological systems. It's really resource intensive, like metabolically expensive for the brain. So some sense of predictability is probably, those are kind of foundational elements. And those are the foundational, the kind of social environment and predictability and the ability to let your brain build predictions about the future. We actually think are kind of foundational aspects of the experience of feelings of pleasantness and unpleasantness and emotions. So it kind of all comes back around. But we study these things in a circuit sort of way in my lab. And we pick the animal model really specifically, not just because they have somewhat similar brains, but also because they share these sort of social and ecological features. So
that's very cool. But a couple of red flags popped up in my head as you were talking, like the learning from our mistakes kind of a thing. Like, we fiddle. Sometimes we fiddle to the point where we're doing more damage than good, and we refuse to accept that damage. I'm looking at climate change, to be blunt. I'm looking at something that we know better. We see all the evidence around that what we're doing is not good for us and threatens our existence in a not particularly long term. And yet here we are. And we refuse to kind of get off. I shouldn't say that. The rest of the world is kind of coming around. It's just maybe that's a regional thing. Like in the United States, we are opposed to it. But that phenomenon where fiddle, danger, we created danger. Let's walk it back. That last part isn't there anymore. Do you find that because of the complexity of humans, we're more inclined to do that, or do you see the same thing played out in rhesus monkeys?
That's a really good question. So in people, right, and there are many people who are working on the mechanics of this from a psychological perspective, like climate change, for example. You've got many different layers of challenges. One is that like my action today doesn't have an apparent reaction on me today or tomorrow necessarily, right? And so there's a sort of distance, psychological distance, physical distance, timing distance between an action and an outcome. I think like to understand the sort of processes you described, there are different ways to come at it. So one way is to study people and to ask the questions about their perception of the problem and their perception of the contribution to the solution, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the other way to study it is to think about the sort of problem space, which is there is an action and it creates an issue. And the question is, what's the time scale on which you address that issue? And those are sorts of things we can study in animals. And we can understand how timing impacts reactions and changes in behavior and problem solving. But I think there's a sort of scaling issue, right? Because between the sort of fiddling around to solve a puzzle and fiddling around to solve climate change, in terms of the importance of collective action too. And different species cooperate in different sorts of ways, and some are very cooperative and some are not cooperative at all. So that's a different variable. I mean, just like there's individual differences in terms of how much I cooperate compared to you cooperate, for example. Species vary that as well. So I think that we can understand those sorts of large issues in people in part by understanding these kind of foundational or fundamental ways that other species and even people do things. So you can bring people into the lab and ask them to solve problems and to project out in the future about how they'll feel. People are really bad at that, as it turns out. And you can build from there and extrapolate to these sort of larger questions. But they're probably there are different mechanisms at play across those scales to some extent. Okay.
And you mentioned, you kind of tipped your hand that you work a lot with rhesus monkeys. So you're seeing, you're in a pristine environment, really, when you're watching the genesis of emotion, and you're looking at it from a very analytical space. You're looking at it from what are the stimuli that go into generating this, and how do we infer human emotion genesis from these things? What are the big differences that you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we in my lab, we're really focused on understanding how experiences or just information processing related to things that are experienced as positive versus negative come to be. And it's not just positive versus negative, right? It's this large continuum. There's like things that feel extremely unpleasant and things that feel extremely pleasant and everything in between. And so the sort of bridge between what we do with non-human animals and what we do with humans is that we think through in humans the sort of fundamental building blocks of emotion, and then we walk them back and see which of them we can study in animals. And we can come at this from a psychological perspective and say, okay, there's these experiences of affect. You feel positive or negative, ramped up or calm. How do we investigate the neural circuits or the biological systems in animals? And where we're headed to is to think about, okay, well, how does affect even come to be in biological terms? And what's going on? What are the systems that are generating the sense of feeling in people? And walk those back. And so that's what my lab works on. So we don't, even though I consider myself in part to be an emotion theorist, we don't really work on emotions a lot of the time. We work on foundational building blocks of emotions in non-human animals. And my argument, and this is not just my argument, many people argue this, that evolution doesn't require emotions necessarily, that most evolutionary challenges can be solved by experiencing positive and negative and some degree of, should I run really fast now or hunker down, right? And so in the human space, that creates a completely different question about the nature of emotions, which is why? What did emotions do for humans? Or what sort of evolutionary pressures selected against our ancestors way back who didn't have emotions? And the current thinking, I think many of us think it's social life, right? So emotions facilitate us living, we think, in like very large groups that are much larger than you would predict just in terms of how groups come to be. But in the monkeys, when we're working on these mechanisms related to positive and negative, and also sensing, so do you have a sense? Because you can experience something negative and not actually feel negative. There's a translation there. And we work on the mechanisms that are related to how you sense your states. And in those cases, we find a lot of similarities. So we see similar sorts of brain networks involved in rhesus monkeys and in humans. And we see similar sorts of sensing. So monkeys can, we think, sense when their hearts are beating, just like humans. And just like humans, some of them are very good at it and some of them are very bad at it. Humans vary hugely in how well they sense their bodies. They also vary to a wide extent on how confident they are. So you can have somebody who's like, oh yeah, I'm sure my heart is beating right now. I'm 100% sure. And they're just totally off. And you have other people who are like, maybe, maybe not. I don't really know. And they're very accurate. And we haven't been able to tap that dimension in monkeys, but we do have a sense based on data where they're watching a stimulus move either with their heartbeat or asynchronously with their heartbeat, that they differentiate between those stimuli. They look for much longer at one versus the other. So we don't know if it's conscious. We certainly don't think they're sitting around and thinking like, oh yes, my heart is beating a little fast now, so I'm going to go do X, Y, Z. But they are processing that information. And based on our neural studies to date, although we have much, much more work to do, we think that that's happening in similar brain areas in monkeys and people. And one of the reasons that's kind of exciting is that those brain areas in monkeys and people are like really different in other species. And so monkeys become a really, really important model if you're interested in anything related to people that could be due to feeling states. So that includes mood and mood disorder, but it also includes things like anorexia. It includes substance abuse, where people's sensing of their own physiological states and perception of them gets disrupted. And so if it's a case that these systems are really similar, we can start to work on interventions and treatments in non-human primates to set the stage for improving animal lives and improving human lives.
Okay, boggling. But even then, so a difference, a patina overlaid on humans and a separate patina over non-human. But even among humanity, there's, as you kind of suggested when we first started this conversation, so many factors that go into it. The two people might not interpret the same stimulus.
Absolutely.
One of the things that comes to mind is like, remember the JonBenet Ramsey case when people saw the interview with her parents? Yeah. America, the world, jumped on a bandwagon of saying they're guilty because they did not respond the way that I would have.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so two different forces sort of at work, right? One is variation in experience, and one is variation in perception. And those things are linked because we think we're using the same concepts to understand our own experience and perceive it in others. And there are huge cultural norms around how this unfolds, and huge variation in norms around expression too. So this is also true, when people are on trial. There is a prioritization in our culture, or at least historically there has been, in people expressing guilt. Right. And there's something about if you know that you've done it and you're guilty, that is a very different situation in a courtroom than if you're not perceived that way. But there are cultures, honor cultures and other sorts of cultures where you would not have any expression, where the right thing to do in a situation, guilty or not, is to have kind of what would be perceived here as being very flat affect. And those can have wide-reaching implications for the justice system, for also for the educational system, right? So you can be standing in a classroom and you have all these faces in front of you of your students, and you have some people react in a particular way and others in a different sort of way, and some are normative to the culture and others not, and that will change how you judge those people unless you really stop and think through it. But yeah, Jean-Benet Ramsey that case is a good example. Also the Boston marathon bombers from years ago now, he was perceived at trial to be expressing no guilt, and that came into play. There's the other thing about like what your experience is, and so in the sort of court case, there's some evidence that when judges try cases or they come to decisions before lunch versus after lunch, there's variation in those decisions based on how hungry they are. And so your own, not just concepts, but your own physiological state can change how you perceive things. And so, we don't have a ton of awareness about that. I think at the kind of extremes, we have some awareness. Like people know they get hangry, right? But the joke in my PhD lab was that we had all fallen in love at least once when we just had the flu. And what we were experiencing was, the stomach in knots and fluttering heart and all this, and it was just influenza rather than a wonderful relationship. In some cases, those people may still be together, but, you confuse these sort of physiological signals sometimes when you don't know their origin. And we don't have a lot of insight into the cultures in which we exist without significant reflection, without having those cultures and that language reflected back to us by other people, or going into a place that's totally foreign, where we have to kind of question the assumptions that we have about how we navigate the world as we are, navigating the world with people who do it in a very different way.
And it's almost going to be impossible to answer, but do you see a lot of the variances play out in your non-human?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's huge. I mean, another reason that we really like working with rhesus monkeys is there's a lot of variation between animals. So we have some cool cats who are just like real chill, some super reactive animals. Sometimes those things predict other things. So sometimes they predict how well they learn in particular contexts, but others not at all. Some animals are real, like jump in the fray of the social action, and others hang out on the periphery. Colleagues at the Primate Center have a model of monkey loneliness, because there are animals who are just not particularly social. But some of those animals seem to want to be social and just can't make it happen. So they're approaching other animals and just not able to get into sort of like deep relationships or even deep interactions with them. And so they're low social but trying to be social. And other animals seem like really satisfied just doing their own thing. So we see that sort of variability in the monkeys, and that's part of the reason that they're a good animal model for humans.
And you can... Are you looking at the circuits, the way the circuits are interact? You said it's a team game up here in the brain. Like that certain things are going to light up certain areas of the brain, and that circuit that will determine behavior, whether or emotion registered.
So brains don't. When I teach this, I say the only time your brain should light up is if your head is on fire, right? So the circuits become active or not. And when we think about lighting up, that's language that's taken from the imaging literature, where we see beautiful colored maps, right, on brains, and they say, oh, the brain is really active there. And those are just statistical maps. They're just representations of numbers, which is interesting because people often interpret it as like, oh, that's something real going on there. And it's the math that we've done on top of the picture. That's our goal. Our goal is, as you articulate, to be able to dissect circuits using tools that allow us to know if they're inhibitory networks, so they're down-regulating function, or excitatory up-regulating function, to understand the particular neurotransmitters that are involved, the types of neurons, how susceptible those neurons are to damage, to plasticity, so recovery. And we've done kind of parts of that so far, but we haven't put the pieces together, and we still have a lot more to do. And in part, that's because the tools to do this work have really changed over the last decade or so, decade plus, because of very significant, very intentional funding from the National Institute of Health for the Brain Initiative, which was set up to develop better tools and to have the tool makers build the tools. So I am a tool user and not really a tool maker when it comes to neuroscience. So when I am going to go do an experiment, I want to dissect a circuit in terms of its processing of affect. I don't want to figure out if the tool works in neurons, right? And so now we're in a place where we can start doing that work because of federal funding and because people have been building tools that we can use in our animals. So that's the hope for the sort of like kind of next 10 years of our lab, is to use these really modern, very precise tools to understand the circuits that allow some monkeys to just hang out and be chill being non-social, and others to want to continue to engage, and some to be just like total social butterflies. Some animals read the room really well, some not. Some animals police, so groups that have animals that intervene in conflict, even if it doesn't benefit them, have a different sort of social stability. And we don't know a ton about why they're able to do that, why they're effective. They have different sorts of approaches to that. But there are all these different social players, and we have kind of just gotten to the place where we have the biological tools that will allow us to disentangle those circuits and understand them.
Wow. Do you see a day when your work, you mentioned there are tool makers and you're a tool user, and you put them chronologically before you. They're making tools that you use. Yeah. Do you see a time when your information will actually inform the production of a tool that there's a lot around like bio feedback kind of a thing.
Sure.
Clothes that can read your emotions. Like your smartwatch can tell your heartbeat, things like that. Do you see this?
Yeah. I think ultimately that's kind of the goal, right? Is that with the sort of most modern tools, and to be clear, we still use old tried and true tools as well, because there are a lot of tools, neuroscientific tools in our tool belt that we just know work really well in a particular environment or test case. But I think we can interrogate and kind of understand the circuits, and then the goal is to develop interventions and treatments for human disease. My focus has always been mood, and so I got into this work in part because I wanted to develop new and more effective. By effective, I mean treating the target problem and not creating other problems, right? So it's not just about relieving symptoms, but not having side effects. Tools for mood disorder, primarily just run-of-the-mill, as it were, anxiety and depression. And so that's always been the goal. But when I got deep into it, I realized that we had a lot of kind of foundational work to do, understanding even what a mood was and how moods came to be. And so we had to kind of back up and do that. But yeah, it's absolutely the case that the goal is to develop tools that can help people and also can help animals. So one of the things people often don't understand about animal research is that often animals benefit from animal research. So there are examples of colleagues who are developing treatments for blindness, for example, and it works in primates, and they're testing these things in humans, different types of genetic origin blindness, but they're able to use these treatments in dogs too. And so their animal research should improve the lives of people and animals. And, we think about, I always kind of thought about tools as, drugs and therapies, but also we are increasingly understanding that particular features of the social environment, the sort of group you live in and the conditions you live in, can also be a tool to improve life. And we can model all of those things as well in monkeys and then test them in people.
And are you gathering data on those like epiphany moments too? I mean, I'm going to play like Isaac Asimov or something. I'm going to pretend I'm writing some kind of science fiction and say, I want to create a scenario in which we can replicate some major crisis moment that made a person better in the end. Yeah.
No, we haven't done a lot of that. We don't really work in that space so much. I think, though, that there's this kind of this thing that we are thinking a lot about, which is how you make discoveries, right? And the sort of science of science, and how you can do science so that what you're doing has the most application and kind of garners the most insights. And there's approaches to that. So it's not so much the studying of the insight itself, but trying to create a context in which we have robust insights that lead our other discovery.
Repeatable results.
Yeah, repeatable or just out of the box. I think, there are different kinds of scientists. There are many scientists who do beautiful, wonderful incremental work where they work on a particular mechanism and they tinker with it. And that word tinker sometimes carries a negative connotation. I don't mean that at all. They're just subtly changing something to understand really precisely what a system does. And they might work on the same system for their whole 50-year career. And there are other scientists that are just like, I'm going to do this. I want to chase this cool thing. or somebody, this is me, somebody walks in the office and they're like, we found this thing. And I'm like, great, let's pursue it, right? And so the sort of arc of my scientific career to the outside observer may appear to be a little bit all over the place. The sort of orienting thing is the study of the neurobiology of emotion and its building blocks. But, we have a project on fetal Zika virus. We've got a project on Alzheimer's. We have a project on social environment and affect. We have a project on predicting long-term outcomes from middle-age psychology into old age. And there are these unifying themes, but we're trying to discover things and shift, not in a small way, but in a big way. The interesting thing is that people who tinker often make big leaps over time, right? And so you often get to the same place, and at the end, everything kind of looks the same in retrospect, but they're just different styles to approaching science.
I'm going to go back to the rhesus monkeys.
Yeah.
Because it's fun.
My favorite friends, yeah.
I know, right? A question. Are they named?
Yes. Yeah. So all of our monkeys have names, and there's actually some scientific research, I was going to say quite a bit, and that might not be accurate, but there's some scientific evidence that when you name animals, people take better care of them, and they remember details about them with greater specificity. They all have ID numbers as well, much like we have social security numbers, and their medical records are linked to those. But yeah, they all have names, and we have a lot of animals, so they have some wild names. But yeah, and they, over time, kind of learn their names if we use them a lot. And so animals that have been with me for a long time, you have a sense that they understand their name if you call it. They'll kind of orient. But yeah, they have names. And in my lab, we prioritize using their names over their numbers to a point that sometimes I have to look up. I'll see a number come in on a health record or something, and I'll have to look it up. And who is that? So that I can jog my memory and understand who I'm reading about.
And personalities too?
Oh, yeah. Huge personalities. And this is part of the reason they're, I think, a really good model for people. So we have very bold animals. The structure of personality is somewhat similar in monkeys and people. So in people, we think about ocean, openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism. I have the E and the A. And we don't see 5 factors in monkeys, but we see 4. And we see that pretty consistently. And that's true in captivity, in this sort of semi-naturalistic environment that we have in the big groups here. And also it's true in the wild. We published a paper a couple of years ago showing that this holds in the wild across species.
Which one's missing?
Which ones?
Of the 5.
They don't map perfectly on, but the one that ends up predicting a lot of things in my group and that I think is really important is boldness, which is kind of a combination of extroversion and neuroticism, maybe a little bit, and it kind of combines them all. So they don't map explicitly on, but what you end up with is monkeys who vary in these things to different extents, much like people vary in these things to different extents. And you can look to see how these particular aspects of personality, or monkeyality as it might be called, predict other sorts of outcomes. So yeah, they're hugely variable. Some are really vocal, others not at all. Some have really strong relationships, others not at all. I see the whole range of behavior.
Yeah. So, and do you think that they are who they are because of the position that they hold within the small society?
That's a really good question, and a really big question, actually. Yes, but so one of the things we can do in animal research that we can't do in human research is we can systematically vary their social environment. We can create groups that have a particular hierarchy, for example, or at least start off having a particular hierarchy based on how we introduce animals to each other. We can look at many different animals and select highly social animals or lowly social animals and form them into a group. And so the work that it's absolutely the case that they are just products of their environment. Largely, they come into those environments with certain proclivities. There's quite a bit of work on maternal style in non-human animals, not just monkeys, but other animals as well. And the behavior of their mothers affects how they come to be. I say mothers in this case very specifically because rhesus monkeys are raised by their mothers and their aunties and their sisters. There's fewer males per group than females, but there are species where males participate a lot in parenting, and in those cases there's a very clear relationship too between paternal care styles and paternal temperament and offspring. But our ability to work with different social systems and have some control over the different social systems allows us to start answering these questions about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And there's some evidence that some animals are going to just be really good at navigating complex social environments kind of wherever they are, and other animals are really dependent on being in a particular type of social environment to do well. And we're disentangling those mechanisms.
Yeah, I could see that. I can see how the context would mean a lot. I know I've behaved differently in certain contexts in different groups, and I think most people would admit to the same thing. I think you're always going to have maybe it's the amygdala. Maybe it's the amygdala that drives an alpha to do what an alpha does, so that they are almost, relatively speaking, unwavering, and they're the driver, the informer of all things that happen. I don't know. I'm spitballing here. It's just fascinating. Your work is just so fascinating, and I can see why you would be like, "Is that interesting? Yeah, let's do that. Let's do more of that." Yeah. So what are some of the things that you have encountered, or one thing that you have encountered that really just made you go, "Wow"?
Oh, every day.
What happened yesterday?
Yeah. So one of the best examples of this is a published paper from 2024. And I use this as an example all the time because our job here is not just to do science, but also to train the next generation of scientists. So we were working on body sensing, what's called interoception. This has been my obsession for more than 20 years. I started to be obsessed with this as a university student. And it took a while to kind of build the foundation that we could start asking these questions. And there's a lot of different systems involved in sensing your body. But one is your skin, right? You can feel touch, but also there's certain aspects of touch that feel good or bad, right? There's sharp pain and there's slow touch. And it turns out that if you stroke the sort of hairy surfaces of your body at a particular slow rate, it feels very pleasant if you're a person. And they talk about it as affective touch. And we have reason to believe, based solely on their brains, that monkeys may experience this too. But also their behavior, because they groom each other. They spend tons of time grooming each other. And it's often at this kind of like slow speed. It's the speed at which we stroke babies' backs to calm them down and so forth. And so my former PhD student, Anthony Sanesteven, wanted to run an experiment where he stroked monkeys' legs while we did fMRI scans of them to see if the same parts of the brain were active that we would expect based on the human literature. Because if that's true, that gives us a mechanism that we can tinker with and start to understand why some people don't find touch pleasant or don't respond to these interventions that include touch, and so on. And I just didn't think it would work. Because here, when we put monkeys in an MRI scanner to get pictures of their brain, they have to be sleeping. They can't be awake right now because our scanner is not located at our center. So we can't train them over time here. Other people do scan monkeys while they're awake. And I thought that the sort of pleasantness that people experience is conscious, not just encoded in the neural circuit. And Anthony just wore me down over some huge period of time. I should go back and look because I tell this story all the time now. He just kept coming into my office like every one-on-one and saying like, I want to rub monkeys' legs in the scanner. I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. Here's why I think this will work. And I finally said to him, you can do it with like the next cohort to go get scanned. And then when it doesn't work, we're done with the conversation kind of. And it worked beautifully. And so we did it with the cohort he started with. And then my subsequent PhD student, Joey Charbonneau, took over the study and ran more animals in it because it worked. And so it's a study of insula activity. It's a part of the brain that codes feeling states, we think, as it is functioning, as it is encoding touch, slow, pleasant touch. But it's much more than that, because it also means that the pleasantness associated with the human experience of affective touch is first being generated by the neural circuit before it even becomes pleasant, right? It's not, the pleasantness isn't inherently just because we feel that way. There's something neural going on. So it's not dependent on consciousness. But also because we saw really interesting changes across the lifespan that we didn't predict at all. So this is the kind of gift that keeps giving study. So emotional life changes a lot with age. People talk about a midlife crisis. Yeah. And then things are supposed to get like much better, right? And there's a lot of debate about how true this is, and what sources of data show this versus not. But at play or at stake or up for debate is what the mechanism would be. And people have argued for a long time that one of the mechanisms is that, like, your time on Earth is limited. You prioritize processing positive things over negative things. And it's all about how you process positive things over negative things. In our study, the monkeys, old monkeys and young monkeys, processed that slow affective touch exactly the same. Activation of the brain looked the same. There might be like little tiny differences because there's some changes that happen with age. But when we do a study like that, we compare the context in which we do the slow, pleasant touch to another context in which we just stroke at a speed that doesn't feel good, doesn't feel bad, but just stimulates different sorts of fibers. And it was there that the old monkeys had a huge difference. And they appeared to be encoding that fast touch as if it were slow, pleasant touch, suggesting that it may not be that older people are just choosing to experience the world as a more positive place, so much as the information that even gets to our brain that we can build our emotions on, maybe seems more positive simply because the pathways from the body to the brain are aging and the information is moving more slowly to the brain. So this is like this shifted totally how I started thinking about aging effects, which we work on a lot. And this would not have come to be if it weren't for graduate students, and in particular graduate students really being very sure that they wanted to do something, and also very persistent with me, convincing me that we should spend a lot of money trying this. And so when I talk about the study, I always tell trainees in the audience, you should wear your mentor down and they will eventually thank you, because there are discoveries that happen all the time that we're not expecting, and they fuel our work to head in different directions. And a lot of the sort of insights in our lab, and I think this is true across research labs, come when somebody who's new to the field or isn't as immersed in the biases and the concepts and the language of a given field thinks like, why does that happen? And then starts to disentangle that in systematic ways.
So that's just organic stimulus response that the brain is treating.
Yeah.
There's no personal history factored into that. Yeah,
well, we don't know, right? So now what the hope is, or like sort of future looking, is to start disentangling those neural circuits relative to animals experience grooming. And, our animals that groom a lot at this speed, do they have a sort of different representation? But our sample was quite large for a monkey study. It had more than 30 animals in it. And they were pretty variable animals. They lived in social environments, but they had different sorts of social experience. So I don't expect it to be hugely dependent on personal history, but if things are generally normative, there's obviously examples where there's pathology, or what we might call pathology, sort of extreme functions or variation that you might expect personal history is involved in shaping those responses.
Have you seen similar results in if you were to do something that was perceived as negative to a monkey during a conscious state? That's this direct trigger that
we haven't looked there.
No.
Well, in terms of like the neural system, we haven't done that. And in part, we haven't done that because there's like much more known about how the brain processes negative information than positive information. So it's kind of, there's a historical bias to that in terms, and also a scientific bias. So the historical bias is that, in the laboratory, it's kind of easier to get individuals, people included, to respond to negative things, right? And the evolutionary explanation for that is like, well, they're more important, right? If you don't respond appropriately to something's good, you've missed out on something good, but you don't end up dead. And if you don't respond to something that's negative appropriately, you end up dead. And so evolution has tuned our responding to negative stimuli in a way that is very potent. And so a lot of science has focused on these things. But there's a sort of complement in thinking about reward processing and pleasantness. And, I have colleagues who study what they call explore, exploit. So how you navigate an environment to find a reward. Do you just keep navigating and checking out new things, novelty seeking, or do you go to the place where the reward is and just get a lot of that reward? And there are individuals that find that sort of seeking to be very positive. It can become frustrating, and there's all these other things, but yeah, in this particular study, we've stayed in this sort of positive space, in part because of the work that's been done in humans and the area of the brain that we're working on, and how we think it's responsible for these sorts of functions.
It makes me think a lot about how I use social media. It's like I have that negativity thrust on me like every single day, more than and I have blocked, trying to inform. The bots, like, I don't want this in my life. I want dogs. Like, give me happy
puppies
dogs.
And
Like, that's kind of where I want to be in life. Let's just give me the things I want, and I'll use you more. But that's kind of interesting, and I can understand that. Like, why you don't want to spend a lot of time on ground that's pretty much covered already. But the payoff in being able to determine what elicits positive response just organically without really relying upon the network. You know what I mean? Like, it's you just going straight to the source. Rub, monkey leg, monkey happy.
Yeah, maybe not happy, but certainly pleasant is our interpretation. And it suggests too that there's some encoding that's just physical, right? There's properties of neurons that are just biased towards sending signals that end up being positive to the brain. There's lots of very different paths many different paths we could take from this study to start to interrogate the specific circuits. And we're starting to work on that because we have an idea now of what part of the brain is generating these responses, and probably responsible for all sorts of other sensing of information, sensing of body states, good and bad. But this current manipulation is what we think positive, most likely positive.
Can you share like one way that you have one thing you decided to pursue based on this?
Yeah. So we so the complement to the monkey rubs study is what we call it internally. The affective touch study in monkeys. The complement to the affective touch study in monkeys is another series of studies about heartbeat sensing. And so I described them a little bit before. This is Joey Charbonneau did this work for his doctorate. And so we sit monkeys in a chair and they're watching a screen, and a stimulus, a shape, bounces either in sync or not in sync with their heartbeats. And they look for longer at one versus another. And this is something that babies do too. So actually the genesis of this was seeing a talk given by a colleague who was working with human babies. So babies tend to look longer at things that are novel or surprising. And so we carried out the same procedure in monkeys, and it's published a couple of years ago. But we've expanded this data set and run many more animals. So we got a grant from the National Institute of Health to run a much larger sample to see how does it play out across, is there variability? In people, there's a ton of variability in sensing the body. So we've confirmed essentially that we can do this in a much larger sample, 40 monkeys, and that we see the variability in monkeys that we thought we should see based on the human literature. And then the question from there is, okay, can we muck about, or can we change or manipulate the body versus the brain to understand where the sensing is coming from? Because one of the big challenges in affective science is understanding the relationship between what the brain is doing and what the body is doing. And there's information that goes from the body to the brain, but there's a lot of information that goes from the brain to the body. And so a combination of the affective touch work and the heartbeat sensing work, combining those experiments in different contexts, and then using manipulations that allow us to, for example, increase heart rate, and change the sort of function of the heart, both in the periphery by changing things that are happening in the body versus things that are happening in the brain, to try to figure out the sort of relationship between these brain-body mechanisms, is kind of where we've headed with that. And we have some evidence that if you increase heart rate, animals become better heartbeat sensors. They can detect their heartbeats better, which is somewhat consistent with the human literature. So now we can go and start to play is flippant. Now we can go and start to disentangle the circuits that are supporting this, and then think about what sort of interventions we might leverage for people. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah. But because of the age-related differences that we saw in the touch study, I started to take the age-related differences in the other studies like really seriously and say, well, maybe this isn't just about affect. Maybe this is just about information processing in general. So we can look at how monkeys pay attention to stimuli in their environments. We can look at how they, decide to make decisions. They engage in decision making, these sorts of things, and that is not a path that we would have necessarily taken had we not had those kind of two initial findings.
That's very cool. So, are you chasing monkey euphoria? You feel free to steal that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. There are people doing psychedelics. We could try that
on this campus.
Yeah. I think, ultimately the work in the group is guided by trying to understand kind of what makes a good life and how to ensure a good life for the most people and the most animals out there. And of course, we know a lot about this, right? We know we need to meet people's basic human needs and animals' basic biological needs. But there are a lot of other things at the margins that we don't know about. We don't understand how we can help people grow old better, age well, what sort of things we can do to relieve loneliness and improve social relationships. And we can even use monkeys to model things like in-group, out-group relationships. So in social psychology, there's a lot of research about why it is that people see each other as comrades or enemies. And it turns out monkeys do that too. And we can change their environments in ways that allow us to understand what we need to do to have people get along better, and understand the mechanisms in the animal, and then test those things for people.
That's kind of cool. I could see like the implications of that being really, really, wow, like the euphoria factories.
Yeah, kind of. So right. It's the good life. It's a question that people have been chasing for thousands of years, right? What makes a good life? And the way we are trying to answer that is in terms of understanding neural circuits, understanding the influence of social environment, or features of the social environment, and then ultimately putting those pieces together to understand what makes us well.
Yeah, wellness is a big buzzword. We're doing a project on wellness, and I think they're projecting like a $10 trillion industry by 2029, which gives you a little bit of an insight as to how valuable it is to the consumer. Boy, oh boy, if you could find a pharmaceutical deliverable out of all this euphoria, monkey euphoria, we'll call it.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Your work is just mind-bendingly great. It's fantastic, and I'm grateful to you for doing what you do. I have to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you get a lot of flack about working with monkeys?
It's a great question. There are definitely critics and loud critics. I think that, we work with the animals that we need to work with to answer a question. But so I always say to my students, like, we don't just work with monkeys because we work with monkeys and then we fit the question to the monkey. We have the questions and then we figure out what animal species, including humans, we should study to answer the questions. And so that actually means studying non-monkey species too, and studying people. And across kind of all of these different animals or these different sorts of studies, the goal is to improve things. So yeah, we definitely, it's a tenuous ethical space, and it's something that we talk about kind of constantly in the lab to make sure that this is a study we should do in the animals versus people or at all. And my hope is that we're doing work that's necessary and important for furthering what we know. There are a number of examples from the last few years where the availability of non-human primates in the U.S. has greatly facilitated human health. So the COVID vaccine is a really good example. So the various components that went into the COVID vaccine, so not just the mRNA, but the stuff that it's floating in and everything else, those components kind of existed in some forms, nascent forms. But part of the reason we were able to get vaccines online so quickly is because they could be tested in non-human primates, and because the nation has a system of non-human primate research centers and other national resources to test those in. And so, the work that we're doing in this affective and emotional space that may have not an immediate, there might not be an immediate solution that is generated from that. Might be some ways down the road, but there are other examples where there's something that happens kind of like it is kind of an aha moment or euphoria moment to create a solution for a major health problem. I think that's one thing that people don't really understand, right? So many people benefit from interventions that have been able to be made and deployed and used in people because of non-human animals and non-human primates specifically, and people just don't know. So, our center was one of the first to document the kind of true biological impacts of secondhand smoke exposure, for example, or the protocols that are used in human IVF. Those initially, there was a lot of work done in non-human primates. So if you know or love somebody conceived or who has a child conceived by IVF, you can thank monkeys. And I don't think we've done historically. We try to educate around that, but the critics are sometimes louder. And much like other systems of public health, so I have colleagues who work in national security or people in my life who work in national security and people who work in public health, and they say that what those share in common is you don't realize their value until they're broken, until those systems are broken. And I think the non-human primate resources and the animal research resources are much like that if they just go away, there will be catastrophic influence on human health and well-being and national security, which was a surprise to me to learn a few years ago. But people don't know that their lives are made better by these resources and by the presence of scientists in this country who know how to do this work. And they won't know it really until their life is directly impacted, whether it's that they get a disease that doesn't have a treatment and it's an animal model that allows for the development of personalized medicine, or a new virus breaks out and we need a vaccine and a treatment. And so keeping these resources going in the current time and space is a huge priority for the scientists working in these places.
And I have to think that, unlike every horror movie in the world I've ever seen, this is not like you don't have monkeys in various states of disassembly. Your monkeys are fairly well treated.
Yeah, so two pieces of that. So the first piece is that animal research in this country, a lot of animal research is very highly regulated. And I say a lot because not all species are covered by the Animal Welfare Act, which is the federal legislation around this. And people say, well, the AWA is outdated in this way or another way. And that's true. And that that legal space has evolved. So over time, additional species have been added to be covered. Non-human primates are a covered species, meaning there is a federal legal structure in place that guides the work that we can do and how we do it. And there are a number of checks and balances on that. So historically, there's an office at NIH called the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, OLA, and they have a say in how this work is done. And then the USDA actually inspects these facilities and enforces the rules and ensures that we're following federal law. On top of that, there is a process by which Congress can ask for more information that they can then use to update the law or change how things are done. And I was part of that process in 2022, 2023. Congress mandated a review of all of the non-human primate work that NIH was funding, or I think more generally federally funded. And so the National Academy of Sciences, which is kind of a neutral body in this conversation, gathered groups of experts in non-human primate science, but also experts in alternative methodologies, organs on chips and testing things in cell lines, to come together and come to a consensus about what the current state was. And that was published. It's actually like a book. And it was quite a process because we were sitting around the table with people, some of whom we really agreed with and some of whom we did not agree with, and we had to figure out what the state of the system was. Then we present that report, and it goes back to Congress, and it can fuel their changing of laws or the enforcement of laws and these sorts of things. So there's this like whole federal system, and then there's state laws or state guidelines, state laws, and then local. So everything we do is approved by an ethics board, and we have to be really specific about what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. And the ethics board includes scientists, but it includes some non-scientists, veterinarians, and so we're working in this like very highly regulated space. And that highly regulated space is one component of preventing not good things from happening. But also scientists have their own ethical frameworks that sit within this space. And there are things that would be allowed according to these various laws that we just like don't do in my lab because it's kind of not it's not that I'm uncomfortable with it, but it's just like stuff that I don't particularly want to do. And so I think you have how scientists behave is kind of part of this whole picture. But the other layer is that this work is very expensive, and it's expensive to keep the animals and to care for the animals. And so the only work that gets done is work that gets funded. And so by the time I'm doing a study, a community of my peers who don't know me personally, because that would be a conflict of interest, have reviewed the grant and deemed it in like the very top of all grants submitted to get funded. So there's all these checks and balances. So that's like on the regulatory side. And then on the like just implementation side, the monkeys here by and large live a really good life. Our animals live in large half-acre semi-naturalistic enclosures with their family groups. Some animals do come inside when they participate in particular experiments. So for example, I did work on Zika virus, and they didn't want the Zika virus out in the wild for obvious reasons. And I have also worked in the field, and I was always surprised when I was in the field because of the injuries and the sickness and the sort of scrappy looking nature of a lot of the animals we were working with. Our animals were healthier, and they get a physical twice a year, and they get food delivered every day and clean water. So that's not to say that we aren't constantly evolving and improving the conditions in which we do work. And one of the things my group works on specifically is understanding how those conditions impact outcome variables. So the sort of intersection between ethics, the sort of ethical and welfare space, and the science we do. But yeah, our goal is to keep animals as healthy and as well as we possibly can, because animals who have high welfare are better for science. And also it's an ethical imperative.
And that wellness of the animal is kind of embedded in this more fractal thing. Like the work that you're doing benefits society as a whole. Hence the government's justified participation in it. Because if I were a government, I would want to know what you can produce. Yeah. And as long as you're not deliberately harming an animal, I think there's 1,000 reasons at least to keep you going. So,
and it's not to say that bad things don't happen or there aren't nefarious players sometimes, but the systems are very robust to prevent, and then if a mistake happens, to correct the mistakes. And I think the average person out and about, our average student actually doesn't know that. We have a large group of undergrads in my lab, and we train them on all of the scientific protocols, the welfare protocols, the ethical protocols, and they often say things like, we had no idea there was so much paperwork. And if a mistake happens, we retrain them, and we retrain them in a slightly different way. You know, we go over and over and over these things. So there are systems at play to catch mistakes. And I think, you know, there are many things that people did as the norm with animals. This is not just monkeys. This is all animals in captivity, 50 years ago, that now you look back and you're like, God, that's awful, or that was so cruel. And it is by today's standards. But the reason we know it's cruel is because the work was done that demonstrated that there were bad outcomes, or, that there was the science itself fueled the sort of ethical discovery. And so there's this sort of cycle, right, where you have a scientific discovery and then you're like, wow, we really should not do that. And I tell my group all the time that if we're doing exactly the same work we were doing 15 years ago, then we haven't evolved fully, because we should be learning from every single study in terms of doing the work better and taking better care of the animals. So there are, and I'm not alone in that, there are many labs that function in that way. So it's a process of constantly improving. And I think in general, people are kind of not aware that that's how things go in the context of a laboratory like mine.
Yeah, because a lot of what they see is the horror movie, or they see the old school documentary that makes you look like a villain, which is not true at all. So I'm gonna do a little wrap up and a little summary, and tell me if I miss any key points.
Okay.
Animals are treated well.
Yep.
They are the work that you're doing is not only valuable for them, but is valuable for humanity.
Yeah.
Some of the work that you're doing is around emotions, around the genesis of emotions, which that in and of itself, the realization that emotion is a byproduct of this tremendously complex network, that it is not my fault. It's not my fault that I don't, respond in a certain way to a certain thing. Everyone's different. I think that uniqueness is understanding that. Sounds kind of common sense when you say it, and from your perspective, you're probably like, yeah, we knew this like decades ago. I didn't, and I don't think a lot of the world does. So I think we're all really in debt to you for the work that you do. And who's your favorite monkey? Do you have a favorite? Oh yeah,
but we'll keep his name.
It's not. What was the?
They'll foil me.
Oh, Caesar? Was that the Planet of the Apes monkey?
Oh yeah, okay. That was an ape. Yeah. We treat their names as like kind of confidential, so that
understandable. Yeah. See, there's privacy levels that are built in. That's going the extra mile.
Data safety, privacy. Yeah, the whole works.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. I can't wait to hear what you unveil. And Tony, was that his name? Your grad student?
Anthony and Joey did a lot of the work that I talked about. Yeah.
Tell them thank you. Thank you for your monkey rubbing endeavors.
Monkey leg stroking. Yeah.
That's right. We've got to be clear on that one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And I hope we can talk again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Eliza Bliss-Moreau. If you'd like to learn more about Eliza and her work, check out our YouTube page for links to her bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Larry Chandler Memorial Studio. Thanks for listening. See you next time.